Welcome to the Enterprise Mobility Roundup podcast, brought to you by Blue Fletch. We discuss technology topics related to Android and workforce devices and how they intersect with business and mobility.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of the Blue Fletch Enterprise Mobility Roundup podcast. This week Richard and I are joined by Lita Hines, who's one of the principals here at Blue Fletch, and we had a recent conversation where we were talking through large projects, so big enterprise projects. And when I think about that, it's typically 3 or more months of building something big that's going to go out in the enterprise. And Lee and myself and Richard were talking through some of the things we've learned in the last 20 years of doing all these big projects, and really came up with, I think, a list of 10 definitive pro tips or big lessons learned that we think are really important if you're running big projects. So Lee, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
Awesome. So the three of us have, I mentioned in the last 20 years, have probably been on, I would guess, over 100 of these large enterprise projects between us. And we've had a lot of really successful ones, and we've also probably been on our share of projects that were on the losing end of the big project successful scale.
Yep.
But I think for me, there's always like red flags we see now, and I know, Richard, you're the best at calling this out. Be like, remember that project? And I'm like, yes, I remember that. But I think for today, we want to talk through just some of those lessons learned, and there'll be some negative ones and some positive ones. But in general, these are things that, as you're thinking about large projects, really to use them as a barometer. There's no one size fits all. But and I guess to get started, Lee, for lesson one, we called this you can't agile a skyscraper. So tell me more about that.
That's right. So a lot of big enterprises and corporations now are tending towards more of this agile development because it's very in vogue in the software development world, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, agile typically means you have a development team that's running in what we call sprints of anywhere from 1 week to 2 weeks to even up to a month. I'd say 2 weeks are probably the most common sprints. But what happens is corporations have started to just go to agile projects and not actually do the planning on the front end. So you can't agile a skyscraper example would be if a bunch of people showed up at a construction site and had a pile of iron next to them and then just started working 2 weeks at a time to build a building. It's not going to turn out very well. You need to have a set of blueprints to work from the beginning. And so that means it's okay to start off with waterfall. We often call that like a requirements and design section of the sprint, so that, or of the project, so that you can actually have an understanding of what you're trying to build at the end of the project, what your outcome is going to look like, or what you want it to look like. So that way you don't end up just spending a lot of money, burning through sprints, and not necessarily making progress.
Yeah, and Richard, any thoughts come to mind for projects or where this hasn't worked, or you have seen people not do this?
Yeah, I think Lee was calling that out a bit, where if you don't have that plan up front, you could almost be that hamster on the wheel. So instead of progressing from A, B, C, D to get down the alphabet, you're just bouncing on B, 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 B. And, in a few months, leadership comes in and says, let me see what you guys have worked on. And it's like, this is what we have. You don't have more. But when you do have that blueprint, when you do that work up front, it's okay to change. And, once you get into that agile environment and you have a roadmap, once you have defined goals and a shared vision, it's okay to change along the way because you're marching, you're moving in the same direction. So I think that's the thing to keep in mind.
Got it. Awesome. So lead number 2 lesson we talked about or jotted down was build a process for learning. What does that mean? Like, what are the key things that along the way in a big project you're learning? I think this kind of follows along Richard's point of changing, but what are the lessons you've learned along the way there?
Sure. I think it was several years ago, Brett, you and I were having a conversation, and it was around the time the move fast and break things phrase was out there in the world, and we decided maybe move fast and learn things was a little bit more gentle and less destructive, perhaps. And so what we often try to do with customers is, if they have a project that they want to work on with us, we try to focus on the core of the issue that they're trying to solve and then figure out a way to get to that answer as quickly as possible. So oftentimes we'll do things like a proof of concept, then move to a pilot. And then from that pilot, once we learn things in the initial rollout, we'll then go back, work a little bit more, and then go to a broader rollout. Multiple releases are super helpful so that you can learn things. If you figure out very quickly something's working or not working, you can do more or less of that thing. And also soft launches are helpful, meaning don't try to go out everywhere at once, go to one store or one location or something like that.
What's you'd given the example, and this is a funny one, of not doing a soft launch. It was a big restaurant chain we were working with. Do you want to?
Sure.
We won't say the name. We'll protect the innocent. But
yeah, we've been doing bug testing on an application in April of a particular calendar year. And as soon as we had a bug-free day of testing, the customer told us that Cinco de Mayo, and this was a Mexican restaurant chain, was going to be the launch day. So there was no soft launch whatsoever, and they just went out and went crazy on Cinco de Mayo with the application and just hammered it, and it was kind of a nightmare.
Ship it. Oh man, that's terrible.
We got it to work once, and then that was it. That was good enough.
Yeah, Richard, for you, any other pro tips on learning or building processes for learning, especially on the dev side?
Yeah, so I feel like I've made my career on that early learning side. So doing proof of concepts, having conceptual vision, getting out in front of the customer, but don't be afraid to release and get feedback, good or bad. We have a client here in Atlanta that we work with. We love them. We work really great with their team, but we have to really almost push them off the cliff to release hardware or to get people into the building to see it, because they want to wait until it's absolutely perfect. And a lot of that comes from a history of IT not delivering for the organization. So they don't want to mess up. They don't want to go back to this bad theme that they had across the organization. And we leave meetings sweating, like it feels like a workout, to get them to say, like, it's okay to have a soft launch. It's okay if we miss the boat a little bit. At least we know, instead of waiting weeks or months before you release something thinking that it's absolutely perfect.
And the risk there too is if you wait and iterate without getting feedback, you can get farther and farther away from the intended goal.
Yep.
Yeah, Lee, that takes us into I think number 3, a good segue into that, which is know thy stakeholders. When you think about stakeholders and who is important in that chain of, I think Richard, you mentioned executives up here and then end users down here. Who else is involved in that, and what's important there?
Sure. So depending on the size of the organization, your stakeholders can be a multitude and varied. You've got the security team, you've got finance, there's operations, there's also the IT team on the other side of the fence, who can be sometimes your partners in programming or the gatekeeper as far as what sort of technologies you're supposed to be choosing or using. So really getting in at the beginning of the project, understanding who the decision makers are, who can come in at a certain point and change the direction of the project. And then also truly understanding what the end user needs and how to balance all of that. So it's a nuanced dance for sure, but the more you know about who you're dealing with and what's motivating that particular constituent group is going to make a huge difference down the road. So it helps at the beginning of a project to ask, is there anyone here or not here that can come in at any point and change the direction of the way this project is going to go?
That guy, the seagull guy.
Mm-hmm.
What do they call it? He flies in, craps over, makes a lot of noise, craps and everything, leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, on the stakeholders for actual users, and you touched on this in the last point, but when you think about end users and finding pilot groups or POC users, what's the big lessons you've learned there around going and finding a site or a store or a warehouse to engage with these users? How do you have that process not go sideways?
Yeah, so I think Lee painted a really good picture, but it's kind of know your end users and know what you can get away with. Most of your organizations, you have a user or a group of users that will try anything and will give you feedback. They're okay failing. They just like to contribute. They like to try new things. they should be your pilot group. They should be that group you go to first. Then when you spread out, there's probably a larger store or site or location. That's okay trying new things. Like, they get it. You probably have a manager there that can run a team and it can help facilitate, especially if you're releasing on Cinco de Mayo. They might be able to know how the store could run, sans technology if you have to shut it down, for that day. But then you also may have to come up with a plan. I know we've ran into that with one of the big retailers we worked here in Atlanta, where there's a store right across the street from headquarters. And, you can lean on the store pretty heavily, but sometimes you got to mix it up. So we had to go across the city to go to different stores and make sure we're not wearing out that team and they can actually get work done from day to day.
Yeah, I also like finding the vocal doubter is a good guy to have in your pilot store. So I call it Carl in receiving. Carl, you're out there, but the guy that if you can win him over, he becomes, he doesn't want to do it, but he becomes advocate for the project long term and really helps you, from an end user standpoint. And I feel like a lot of times there's people who are in the stores or in the warehouses that are overlooked by the executive team, and they complain, but their feedback is valuable. They've been doing the job for 20 years, and like you said, they know how to run it without the technology.
Yeah.
And your job is really to make their job better.
Yeah, that's a change management thing. Usually Carl is a high performer that's done things his or her way and has their routine down to a T, and I don't need you messing with it.
Yeah, there's a quadrant for Carl where he lives. Yeah, for sure.
All right, so Lee, and I skipped over one of them that you had mentioned, but it was I think lesson 4, which was understand your constraints. Can you tell us more about when you think about constraints on large enterprise projects? What are they? What are the things that people should be thinking about?
Sure. And, we talk about this internally as an organization too, when we are working on our own product and how to scale it. But nothing is impossible given the right resources and the right constraints. And so one thing to keep in mind when a customer comes to you and says, can we do this? The answer is never no. The answer is always yes, with a team of this many people and this much time and this much budget, this is what we can get you based on what you're trying to do. And oftentimes what happens is you end up somewhere in the middle because the customer doesn't necessarily want to dedicate an 8-person team for 26 weeks. But what you can do is walk that back and say, here's an initial release that we can focus on. Again, to go back to our first point, you can't agile a skyscraper, but you can learn a lot along the way. Point 2, you can learn a lot by building a model for learning. So I think that's how you approach that, is know what you can do given the constraints around you and try to put the customer in a position where they can get the most information based on budget they have, time they have, and the amount of resources they can dedicate to it.
Yeah, Richard, on the technology or development side, are there certain constraints you see a lot or think about from resources or teams or technology?
I know one that comes up quite a bit is just know your organization. Sometimes your organization can be the constraint. And let me take a step back. So broader organization, it could be because it's regulated. So the things that we do could be regulated because it's a utility company or airline. If we're working in Europe, it could be GDPR. Oftentimes, if we're doing something crazy innovative in a state like California, it could be privacy laws because they differ per state here in the U.S. But oftentimes, it could be the organization. There could be an architectural review board or a security board or a deployment group that is the constraint and requires a lot of overhead to manage, and sometimes almost requires as much investment and time to get them on board as it is to develop the solution. So, there's been times where we've developed technology and the technology selection and architecture was driven by what we knew was going to come down in the organization and be a constraint later on.
Yeah, for me, the big thing that comes to mind is the InfoSec teams. I feel like most projects want to avoid InfoSec. For me, and I did this on a bunch of projects, I would try to get the InfoSec guys involved early on. I had one of the the CSOs say, I love you guys because you guys actually ask us at the beginning as opposed to asking right before you go to production. And it makes a big difference getting that stakeholder buy-in from those teams early on. They can definitely shut a project down. Legal, security, HR
Absolutely.
will definitely shut projects down if you haven't involved them early on. So it goes back to that stakeholder piece too as a constraint.
And oftentimes you'll find if you involve them early on, they'll help you out and point things out to you that they probably wouldn't to other people because they want you to succeed.
Yeah, you can keep them involved. Lead number 5 was ask or understand the value or ROI or I think we call it like the business case analysis for the projects, and know what that is and what are the lessons you've seen around that, or what are the pro tips you have there.
Sure. A lot of times we'll talk to organizations where they have us come in and want us to do something for them, but maybe haven't thought through a lot of the specifics. And you find this out when you start asking follow-up questions around why are you doing this project, or what is your end goal? Well, how do you think that this is going to help your company overall? And sometimes you're met with just sort of silence or a blank stare. And so it helps to, and that doesn't mean the project shouldn't go on, but it's part of our job to help someone understand the value of what they're going to be hiring us to do and how it can make a difference for the company. A lot of times you see people fall victim to fads where, you've got machine learning with AR and craziness that you can do where maybe your website doesn't even work. So, don't put VR on your website if the main nav doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like start with the basics.
I think that was my favorite was the fad technology. Like, oh, somebody else is doing this, we need to do it. And then we looked at it, and I think they got was less than 1,000 downloads from the App Store, and they'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on an app, and they didn't have the feature I really love on a lot of retail websites is you might also like when I buy something or when I'm looking at something, give me 10 options for stuff that I might also want to buy. It just makes it so easy for me to buy more stuff from you. I want to spend my money with you. And instead people are looking at crazy technology and really trying to push the envelope when they should be really thinking about what their users want to do. And Richard, is there anything for you've seen where people put fads over value or really think about they're not thinking about the ROI for their customers, their employees, as opposed to thinking about doing something flashy and neat?
Usually I see that when that fat is tied to that individual at the organization.
The executive.
They're looking to make it could be an executive, it could be a manager, director, developer, but they're trying to make a name for themselves. They're trying to do something that pushes the envelope that's outside the box, because if it works, it's going to help them potentially get a promotion or get a larger project or more responsibility that they're gunning for. So if they don't feel like they can be talked off the ledge and they're just really pushing for that, it's usually a personal motive behind that you need to uncover.
It's like, if this is going to be the best thing if it works, but it's the stupidest thing if it doesn't work. So
sounds like a Simpsons episode.
It'd be stupid not to do this.
Not licking toads. Lesson 6 was invest in tools that allow you to measure the before and after. And this is sort of aligned to that value one from before. But I guess, Lee, you want to talk about some of the tools and how you've seen people use tools to actually understand the value drivers and the impact?
Sure. So I think some of the examples that we want to talk about here, we've seen that have worked, is someone will look at, let's say it's varying stores and how they perform and how their associates perform in the field from a sales perspective. And then if they did with us a pilot, for example, where one store was able to have a mobile point of sale system outside the store where they had a yard or a warehouse where they were also selling product, and they saw a lift in that one store, then maybe they should invest in a program that makes that more systemic. So I think essentially what the gist of what Brett, you're getting to is try to understand how you can make technology serve your business better and how you can measure for it before and after, so you're not just putting something out there and hoping that it works.
Yeah, for me, I think that example you sort of touched on this, and I think Richard, you and I were in this, but we have a support agent included in the Blue Fudge tool set, And one of our clients was piping sales data along with actual usage. So they could see when employees were using devices to sell on the floor. I think they got, it was a double-digit lift in sales, which for them justified the cost of spending $1,000 for these rugged mobile devices. They're expensive, and it's expensive to put technology and software in employees' hands. But they were able to go to the board and say, "Hey, look, these 3 stores where we put these devices, we're getting double-digit lift on all the employees," which it's pretty meaningful, especially over multiple years.
Absolutely.
Richard, this is lesson 7 is probably right up your alley, which is have a pragmatic technology selection approach. I know you've been on the receiving end of a lot of bad technology
Yes.
and had to make stuff work. And I know you and the team make a lot of magic happen. But I guess, can you talk a bit about your thoughts or your lessons when you think about how companies should be selecting technology up front at the beginning of these large enterprise projects?
Yes, I think it encompasses probably all of the points that we talked about before. So, do they have any data that's going to help make this technology selection? What lessons learned? Do you have feedback out in the field? But yeah, I've been on the bad end of some technology selection, and in my career, I've made some selection that wasn't the best, but it was the standard at the time. These big companies were using it. Little did I know that something else was going to come along and blow it away in 2 years. However, I had data, I had lessons learned, not only from us, but other companies that look like us and our customer. So, at the end of the day, we could live with it. But, how big of a risk are you taking? Is it supported by a big community? Can your developers get feedback? Can they get help online? Is it supported? How well is it supported out in the field? And then what else is coming along? Does it seem like, big company like Google is supporting a library or a standard or a framework that could compete with it one day? And then it comes down to architecture. I think companies and architects or distinguished architects, whatever they're called in your organizations, are getting better at creating products that are slightly agnostic, meaning that if another cloud provider or something different changes down the line, you don't have to rewrite the entire thing to make that adjustment. You could make small tweaks or make adjustments over time that can move you in the right direction. So there's no one right answer, but it's having the data to be able to defend your decision later on, but also architecting in such a way that you don't box yourself in if you don't have to.
Yeah, Lee, are any examples come to mind of you where you've seen this fail?
There's been many, just like Rick, but when you have a customer come to you and say, we want to use a loyalty platform for our application from a deal management perspective. And then when you start looking at the loyalty program that they've selected and signed a contract with, you realize that it doesn't actually exist, is an example.
Vaporware.
Exactly. Yeah. So be aware of vaporware. But as the non-architect, non-developer in the room, I think Rick hit the nail on the head, and you do see enterprises learning this lesson now, is trying to be as modular as possible so that you don't have everything tied into one system that if one piece fails, the entire thing fails.
We all built a Flash app at some point in time, right? Richard, just dive into this point a little bit more. The buy versus build. Do you have any tips or guidance around that? So using off the shelf pieces versus building something from scratch. I know we've seen it go both ways, good and bad.
Yes, it goes back to my point. Don't box yourself in, right? There's organizations that we work with that it's almost a hard requirement that you build everything. They don't want to buy anything. They don't want to get stuck. They don't want to be behind on an update or have to wait for an update to quote unquote innovate within the company. So it's a balancing act, right? So if you don't have a core set of engineering or development talent that has a history of building things and supporting things and not boxing yourself in, you really want to consider, potentially buying. And then it depends on what you want to buy too. So there are systems out there that support HR or CRM systems or ERPs that you probably should buy unless you have a very deep focus or you have a business process that is unique to yourself. When you build things, you want to build it because it's bespoke to you. Like you have trade secrets. It's a unique way of doing things. So it's really a balancing act. But I think if you're going to build, you have to have some trade secrets, something that's very unique, and you have to have a team or a vendor like Blue Fletch that you trust to support it. If it's bigger systems that is touching all the organization that encompass like an entire department like HR or sales or even analytics, buy.
Got it. And Lee, I think this is a good.
Don't build Splunk, is what you're saying.
Don't build Splunk.
Do not build Splunk.
Buy Splunk.
Yeah.
I think this is a little bit of segue lead into the next one, which is know when to replace legacy systems versus bolt onto them or reuse them. But I think this can go either way. I know we've seen some bad examples of people trying to put lipstick on a pig. But what what are your lessons there?
Sure. And first thing you have to do, I think, when you're coming in as the outside vendor, like a Blue Fletch, like we do, is be sensitive to the historical investment that an organization has made in a product or something that maybe they made from scratch. And the person you're talking to across the table from you, it could be their baby. And so you don't want to call that baby ugly to that person's face. So I think understanding the sensitivities and why someone may feel that they need to hold on to something can help them release the grip on it a little bit. But making sure that you look at the cost of new development on top of an old system, and is it going to take that much more time and effort to make it work with something that may be on its last legs versus investing a little bit more in a new system that you can update more easily long term. Might be painful, but having that conversation with the customer and having you get from them why they feel the way they do, I think goes a long way. We are software developers, but empathy is a big part of our job. And an example of that is just where bad technology has an opportunity to be better, but just isn't. We talked with someone recently, Richard and I did, where they have a point of sale system in a restaurant, and they put the exact look and feel of the point of sale system on a mobile device for the servers on the floor. And the person we were talking to even said, we know that the point of sale system is ugly and no one likes it, but it's what they're used to. So I think there's an opportunity there. Why wouldn't you just try to make it a little bit better and easier for the server at that point?
Yeah, Richard, any thoughts on the one for one port? I know we've helped a lot of companies move from Windows CE to Android, and we always get to ask, we want the exact same look and feel and all those exact same screens on on Android device that we had from our Windows CE device in 2002. But what are any examples coming to mind there? Things that people should really take a step back and take advantage of things?
A lot of examples. I'm about to go on a Rick rant. So the example you gave, porting one-to-one, so Windows CE applications that look like Windows CE applications on modern Android worked because they had almost 500,000 associates they would have to retrain. We had a very tight timeline, and they were committed to rewriting all those applications. Not only that, transforming their whole IT process. So that was a bridge that had or call it a skyscraper, that had a very well-defined blueprint. We knew exactly what we were doing, and I knew that, I was falling on a grenade. So it wasn't a surprise. I signed up for it, and so I was happy to do that. A bad example of that was a company that we worked with that wanted a one-to-one port because this is going to get retired because we're going to roll out SAP in a year. So I just need this to only work for a year. And, that was a plan that was rigid, and we weren't able to change. We weren't able to influence the decision. Hence, 4 years later, they come back and now they want to make updates. to that thing they were supposed to retire 3 years ago. And so because they were so rigid and didn't have any changes, it's a very rigid structure because it was very complex. It's going to be very hard to change, and it was very hard to develop and support that. But then you have some companies that are in heavily regulated industries where, they flip on a computer in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and they haven't turned it off ever. So, they are well suited, but also more open because of that constraint to build technology that sits on top, because it's very hard and almost a traditional retirement when you retire a system, because it's been on for 30, 40 years. Like, it literally retired.
It's crazy. Yeah, it makes me think of some of the military computers. Have you ever seen, I think there was a Dateline where they did a walkthrough of a submarine, like a nuclear submarine. It was running, I think all the computers had Windows 2000 on them still, just because it worked. And
yeah,
they're when it works, they stop doing updates because they want it to work for the next 20 years.
They had the perfect version. They had the perfect probably processors that like didn't die. They weren't the fastest. They weren't the best, but they're probably the most efficient. They never break. And it just works.
Lee, lesson 9, skipping back around a little bit, but lesson 9 was don't be cheap. And I know it's a little bit cheeky, but I think the real thing here is to think about value versus cost. You want to dive into that a bit, or some examples there?
Sure. So we run a organization that charges money, and we do it for profit. So when we put dollar signs in front of people, it can be something that takes them aback. But what you have to focus on when you talk with your customer is the outcome of the project, and looking at, if you invest this is what you're going to get on the back end of it. One of our customers on the Blue Fletch Enterprise side was losing, I think, between 8 and 9% of their devices on an annual basis. Once they installed our launcher on their devices, they were able to track them more easily, and that loss rate went down to 2% annually. So that immediately paid for itself over the course of a year. So even though it's a cost to the organization, you have to look at whether or not it can save you money, or even in some cases make you money. We had another customer that has tens of thousands of employees talking to each other all over the world on a varied fleet of mobile devices and also desktop, that the product that we put in front of them that they ended up using, that we built for them, probably saves 3 to 4 minutes per major interaction that they're trying to deal with per day, per location around the world. And it's probably saved them over $1 billion for an initial investment that was definitely under $10 million. So I know a lot of that has to do with who your stakeholders are. And I know, Rick, you had some thoughts on that in terms of how to get them involved and how that helps.
Yes, because I think some of our best projects came because executive buy-in or buy-in at the top was there early on, and they were okay investing in the money because they knew their ROI was going to be exponential, and it gave us the freedom to do what we wanted to do, but also remove some constraints that customers sometimes would put on us artificially, because they may be protecting themselves or wanting to stay on budget or making sure that they had cushion.
Yeah, I think this sort of goes back to one of the early points, Lee, we talked about, which is if you know the problem you're solving, you should be able to actualize what it's going to cost. So they knew, if you could save 3 or 4 minutes per outbound, that you would, across a day, you're going to save this much. Across a year, you're going to save this much. And over 4 years, you're going to save this much. So it was definitely $1 billion of savings for a $10 to $20 million project. So it was very, very beneficial for them. In the last lesson, Lee, we talked about was the willingness to shelve a project if it doesn't work. And this is always painful, because especially when you work on something, it becomes your baby, and having to put it down sucks. But like, what are the thoughts or experiences you have there?
Yeah, I definitely have a couple projects that are in that Indiana Jones warehouse, getting wheeled away as the credits go up the screen. But I think, one of the reasons we talked about building the process for learning is so that you don't get into a situation where you work for 30 weeks on something and it ends up not working. That's why you do the POC. That's why you set a hypothesis and try to answer that question. It's not focused on being right. It's focused on learning the answer to that question and then deciding whether or not you can go forward. So, don't get caught up in the initial sunk cost fallacy of building a POC or doing that initial requirements and design and then POC, because that's going to be much cheaper than going away for 6 months and then deploying something and figure out it doesn't work.
Yeah, and I have one example. It kind of goes back to the pilot and POC where it was pretty expensive. It was probably $250,000 POC. We put it in 10 stores and tested it and looked at it and said, it's not working. And if they had rolled it to 1,000 stores, it would have been millions and millions of dollars, and it just didn't get the lift we needed. And the executive team had enough wherewithal to look at it and say, this didn't get us that lift. Let's not do it. And the ability to walk away from that, it's tough because we as developers or technology or in IT, you put a lot of work into it, and it's hard to walk away from. But the end goal for everybody is to really make our companies as successful as possible, and the folks you're working with and working for.
And sometimes those projects come back. So just because it's on the shelf doesn't mean that it's never going to come back. Sometimes you're just 2 or 3 years too early. Maybe the technology is too new. We're working on a project right now where the ROI is, a mid to high 9-figure number. And we've probably spent $2 million at this point. But because of the complexity of everyone involved, not necessarily the technology, because it involves, a tech team, a customer, and their vendors to all work together, share information, have these handshakes, make sure that when things go out, that they go out properly. The process for the customer vendor relationship, I don't think is ready to support such a technology. But that technology, I think, is ready, and I think it can help them, find that 9-figure live tour money.
Yeah, $300 million a year in loss is a big one. So
opportunity, and so it's 50-50 right now. It may get shelved, it may go on, but I think if it does get shelved, it's going to come back and look a little bit different.
Yeah, I think Lee, you and I talk about this. I think there's a A16Z quote around. Was it early and wrong
are the same?
Yep. Which we've had some of those. We've built stuff and then it didn't work. 3 years later, the client came back because the technology was finally ready for it. And I think that's if you do the POCs, if you be able to measure things, you're going to know whether you're ready or not for it. So it's definitely you got to take a step back sometimes and look at it.
Yeah, I think the key is focusing on the problem you're trying to solve. And if the problem is still valid, then that project will find a way back.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So those are the 10 lessons. I'll do a quick recap here. But the lesson 1 was you can't agile skyscraper. So I know the Empire State Building was built in 14 months, which is amazing every time I go see it. But they had a spectacular plan and then moved super fast. And I think that's big projects. You got to think the same way. Second one was build a process for learning, and for us, it's actually one of our core values in our company is learning and thinking through and building and growing. Number 3 is know thy stakeholders. So whether it's Carl in receiving or whether it's the ops guys or HR folks, make sure you involve them early on and get those stakeholders in there. Number 4 was understand your constraints. So there's certain hard constraints, whether it's legal, whether it's the speed of light. There's certain things you can't overcome, but everything else is solvable with enough money. You can give me a long enough lever, and we can move the earth, I think is the quote. Number 5 was understand the value of the project. So that's just knowing the desired outcome, the pieces there. Number 6 was invest in tools that allow you to measure the before and after. So whether it's pulling data out of your different systems, be able to measure things. It's really important to build that so you can justify it, especially during POCs and pilots. Number 7 was the pragmatic technology solutions selection process. So, whether build versus buy, understanding what tools to go to, what vendors to work with, having a process for that as opposed to just whatever's first or whatever's coolest. Lesson 8 was understanding replacing legacy technology, reskinning versus actually updating, like when to do that, and building and doing analysis around that is really important. So the buy versus build. And then lesson 9 was don't be cheap, which I think it's probably a little bit close to understanding the value, but once you know the value, you know how much to go invest in things. So if it's a $250 million a year savings, you can pretty easily know what you need to justify if it's possible. And then number 10 was willingness to shovel projects. So if something doesn't work along the way, make it okay to actually step back and walk away from something if it's not going to work. Don't continue pouring good money after bad. So those are the 10 lessons. Lee, is there any wrap up or key things? I know these are some of the bigger ones we saw, but is there any other wrap up as people think about these large enterprise projects and things that you've seen or lessons you've learned in the last 20 years?
I think as I'm looking through these 10 lessons again, the main thing that comes up in all of them is really understanding what you're doing before you start. And I've heard Rick say this to me, countless times, is we've been doing this long enough that we know what works and we know what doesn't work and what kind of smells funny. And so take some time on the front end of a project before you jump in and put code down and really understand what it is you're trying to come out with at the end of the day, and then start working on it. Have a plan before you start.
Yeah. And Richard, for you, anything that's paramount in this list or the most important thing for you?
I think know your value and ROI. One of the most frustrating things for me as a leader is to be brought in to solve a problem I've gotten really excited about. I've motivated the team, and I don't feel that is. I don't feel the same energy coming back from the customer, whether it's they're playing coy and realize that they're solving a big problem, therefore they're trying to push me down on price or whatever, and not be excited about it, or they're just being cheap and just trying to spend a little bit of money and hoping that they get lucky. That's the difference between a frustrating project that is okay and is successful versus having something that's truly transformational for that organization and the people that it affects.
Awesome. Well, Lee, thanks again for joining us this
Thanks
week.
for having me.
Appreciate it. And as always, if you enjoyed the episode, give us a like or a star or follow. And if you have any questions or follow up, reach out to us at info@bluefletch.com. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Enterprise Mobility Roundup podcast. If you enjoyed the discussion, please take a few moments to rate us. If you would like to listen to future episodes, please subscribe. To learn more about mobility topics or submit any questions, visit us at bluefletch.com.